So there's not much time, and these guys are the experts. Nothing important about me here. Basically, that I got really interested in neuroscience through trying to understand latency. I met Micha a couple of years ago, who basically helped me understand that latency is a construct. And I'd like to just dive in and have these esteemed scientists introduce themselves, please. Susan.
Hello. Glad you're here. And glad I'm here. I'm Susan Rogers. I am a professor at Berklee College of Music.
Susan didn't tell you that she was a sound engineer for Prince.
I'm a recording engineer, a record producer, and a mixer, and I'm a PhD, and I got all kinds of things going on.
She's awesome.
But currently, I'm a professor for Berklee, teaching neuroscience and psychoacoustics and all that for Berklee Online.
And I'll share her book afterwards. Ryszard, please.
Hi, my name is Ryszard Auksztulewicz. You can call me Ryszard. I'm an assistant professor at Maastricht University in the Netherlands, and I am also a neuroscientist. I'm not an engineer, music engineer. I have worked with Prince. I think I've done one DJ set in my life, but I'm very much interested in music, both personally and scientifically. And I work mostly on prediction in the brain, how the brain predicts things.
And Micha.
Yeah, my name is Micha. I'm an assistant professor at the University of Amsterdam, where I work at the intersection between cognitive science and AI. So I study how both artificial systems and our biological brains understand language and can make sense of the world. And then, much like Ryszard, I have a particular interest and specialty in the role of prediction. So the predictive brain and the role that prediction plays in how we understand speech, how we listen to music, and also how we develop and train modern AI systems, and the role of generative models such as currently very successful large language models, and what they may mean about the generative processes in the brain.
Great, thank you. Susan, what got you interested in neuroscience?
You know, I think like all scientists, just curiosity, just curious about stuff. I was in the music business and was very successful for 22 years. And just as my career was peaking, I was experiencing a calling to maybe work in the sciences. I thought I would like that. And so I was able to make it happen by having a hit record and going to college for 8 straight years, getting a PhD. And turned out my instinct was right. I love investigating the brain and systems. It's endlessly fascinating, and it's good knowing that we will never fully understand it. Okay. That's part of the attraction.
That's my last question answered. Ryszard, so you've been working in cognitive neuroscience. Is there anything particular that took you into that field?
Yeah, actually, well, it's very similar to Susan. I was just curious mostly about how the mind works. So I actually studied I started to study psychology and philosophy at first, and then I noticed that you can only answer so many questions with staying at the level of behavior and sort of reflection. And then I went deeper and deeper into the brain research. So first as a cognitive neuroscientist, where I just tried to look at the neural correlates or signatures of some cognitive function. But then I went deeper into computational neuroscience and also what we call systems neuroscience, which in my case meant systems of neurons in an animal brain, listening to sounds and predicting different sounds. So I tried to attack the same questions from different perspectives.
Thank you. And Micha, we met a couple of years ago and you were teaching me, basically introduced me to the idea of prediction. And how is that related to your research and how did you get into neuroscience? And you're also very interested in music and language.
Yeah, well, maybe let's start with how I got into it. It's a bit, there's a personal backstory there. I sort of personally as a kid, and maybe also coming from a family with, let's say, a talent for psychiatric conditions, I was confronted with psychiatry very early on. And from a young age, I became sort of pretty mesmerized by the fact how such a small pill can make such a profound difference in your way of being. And so going to college, I was really deep into the mind-body problem and the relationship between the physical and the mental. And this is why I ended up studying neurobiology. But I quickly found out that only studying like the molecules wasn't all there was for me. So I did a bit of philosophy on the side, and in the end, it sort of ended up in the mixture, in the sort of interface between AI, so formally modeling information processing, and studying information processing in the brain. And this is also where my interest in prediction comes from, because it's a way to formalize what the brain is doing on a computational level and bridge that between facts we know about the biology.
Thank you. We have a room here full of audio professionals. It's full. There's people standing at the back. You can only see the first 3 rows, but there's a lot of people here. It's really fantastic. Why are we all drawn to music? What is the pleasure in this to our brains?
I'll go first if we're taking turns. The neuroscientists call musical behaviors a whole brain workout compared to speech or compared to the visual modality. When we listen to music, it activates pretty much every general area of the brain, which is one of the reasons why musical memories can be so incredibly robust, because there are so many paths. Neurally, there are so many paths that are activated as we listen to a musical signal. And that makes it kind of a treat for us. It's easy to process. There's a wide range of it. We get to choose the music that we like the best and ignore the rest. And it's pleasurable, it's easy, and our brains apparently really love it.
Thank you.
Yeah, maybe just to follow up on that. So, of course, maybe we can also try to take sort of zoom out a little bit. Of course, in this audience, many people and also these panelists are fascinated with music, but the same type of a workout can perhaps be achieved also with storytelling and other activities. But music does indeed have this whole brain nature, so it forms interactions between auditory regions, but also motor regions and all kinds of other regions that we will probably come back to. But it's also like an interesting example. So Susan mentioned a workout. It's kind of like an interesting environment, a sound environment where we can explore different possibilities. And quite a lot of this exploration actually comes to prediction or uncertainty. So for example, quite often there's some level of unpredictability in music that is then resolved. So our brain kind of gets this exercise of, okay, how could this melody go? And then it lands somewhere and yeah, we could have predicted that, right? So there's this satisfaction in exploring the rules of music and then resolving them and figuring it out.
Micha, you have anything
to add? Yeah, I have very
add?
little to add. No, I have very little to add. I think this is exactly it.
Great. So what evolutionary benefits are there to being able to describe rhythmic alignment and therefore comprehend and create music? Or is it a side product? Pinker's cheesecake, I believe it's called.
I'd be so curious to hear what Susan thinks of that.
Oh, goodness. You guys know better than I that the brain's main job is to tell us what's happening out there in the world. All of our sensory organs evolved to give us a realistic picture of what's happening in the world so that we can predict what's going to happen. Thinking organisms love prediction because it's necessary to survival. I'm eager to hear both of you talk more about entrainment and neural oscillations. But for this audience, know that our nervous system oscillates at various frequencies throughout the day and night, and that at any given point in time, certain frequency bands are dominant, depending on whether you're awake or asleep or whatever. When we hear music with a regular isochronous pulse, and we can extract the rhythm from music, which not everyone can do, but nearly all of us can, that allows us to hitch our wagon to the star of music and more accurately make predictions about what's going to happen in the next few seconds. again, as I said earlier, the brain loves making predictions and being right. And that's one of the reasons why music is such a treat for us, is that rhythm and that ability to synchronize our bodies to it and to predict where it's going to go and what it's going to do to the extent that we can. But we love our surprises too.
So do you believe there's a specific evolutionary adaptation for music, or that it's a byproduct of sort of existing system?
I'm a committed Darwinist. No, I've just recently written a chapter for a textbook I'm writing on music cognition, and I finished the chapter on music and evolution, which starts the book. I've read the modern theorists. They're great, they're smart, and for the audience, what the current theories propose is that our musical brains, and they propose that we do have musical brains, evolved for social reasons. But Charles Darwin, the other Chuck D, Charles Darwin proposed that music essentially evolved for courtship, to facilitate the most urgent and ardent need we have, which is to mate. And he proposed that our sense of rhythm and melody evolves to facilitate courtship rituals. And I'm with him 100% on that.
Maybe just to follow up on what you said about entrainment and actually how this could also play a role here, right? So this notion of entrainment is that where our brain has some oscillations going on, and because the structure of the environment can be quite rhythmic as well. So if we listen to someone talk, quite often syllables happen at specific rhythms. They're not very regular rhythms, but nevertheless, we can predict when things will happen. And so this can entrain our brains. So basically the neural oscillations can track these environmental rhythms. And I think what is important in the context of evolution is that, one of these ideas related to social bonding is that actually music is like a driver that actually can synchronize different brains with each other, right? So I'm listening to the same music as you are, and therefore our brains become more entrained to the same thing, but also to each other. So if we, for example, sing together, or if I, improvise some piece of music on an instrument and you respond to it, this is also creating this kind of a communication, by entrainment or synchronization.
If I can add to that one, maybe counterpoint or to push back a little bit, sort of from my personal sort of viewpoint, because there's this debate about what Rebekah referred to as the auditory cheesecake argument, where Pinker wrote, is the brain evolved for music? And he said no, just like the brain hasn't evolved a taste for cheesecake itself. But the reason we like cheesecake is that it sort of co-opts pre-existing taste preferences. And I don't want to make any claims against sort of the role of music writ large, but if we zoom in, and I think Susan is much more sort of knowledgeable about this, and I take her point deeply, but if you zoom into the phenomenology of music, so why do we experience the pleasure of music and the sort of the pleasure of this balance between predictability and unpredictability? I would think there's a case to be made for some more general principles going on. Because if you think of the tip of the tongue phenomenon, for instance, where it's incredibly frustrating that you think you know something and then you are worse than you expected, I think sort of the pleasure of we experience in understanding music and appreciating the patterns is like exactly the opposite of that. So there's a joy of understanding, a joy of sort of suddenly finding a pattern, the joy of debugging, as Daniel Dennett wrote, in the context of humor, actually. And there's this frustration in not finding a pattern, in not knowing something you think you know. And good music plays with patterns and our brain's ability to recognize abstract patterns. And so sometimes you unexpectedly find a regularity, you understand something that you didn't think you understand. And I think that the pleasure we get from that, so it's a very particular part of the phenomenology of music. So this is not music itself, but why we like sort of the aesthetics of music is something more general. And you do find it also in appreciation of art, solving puzzles, visual patterns, things like that. So Yeah, in that sense, sort of the experience and the joy of music and the joy of the unpredictability of music is a bit like auditory cheesecake.
You're right, Micha. The question is still being debated, and it will be for a long time. And a lot of theorists are really divided on this. The essential question is, are our brains musical? Are we inherently musical? There's evidence for and against it. Most theorists these days are saying that they're starting to lean toward the notion that we are inherently musical because the new neuroimaging tools have found regions of the brain that respond specifically to music. Here is something awesome that just came out in the last few years. Turns out that there is a cluster of cells, of neurons in the brain that respond only to sung music. They don't respond to instrumental music. They don't respond to speech. Music with lyrics causes this particular region of the brain to light up like a Christmas tree. Now, the great Ani Patel says, hold on just a minute here. There's also a region of the brain that responds to printed words on a page that allows us to read. It doesn't say that we evolved to be readers. The visual word processing area, just like the music processing areas, evolve over time through what they label gene culture co-evolution. If anything is important in our world, you guys I'm sure will agree with this, if anything is important, we learn to get really good at it. Like my friend Tommy says, anything you do a lot, you get really good at. So be careful what you do a lot. Experience-dependent neuroplasticity could cause us to be able to play guitar and sight read. That's a varsity level cognitive task. We didn't evolve to be able to do that, but we do have the neural infrastructure that would permit us being able to do that. What the current theorists say is melody and rhythm. If we're musical at all, we are inherently rhythmic in nature, which I know you guys are studying, and we're also inherently evolved to recognize information in pitch changes and intervals. Absent of words, melodic pitch changes signify a type of information, mainly emotional intentionality. Here's what I'm feeling. Here's what I'd like you to feel in response to what I'm putting out there when we make music with each other.
But just maybe to add to this idea that rhythm is somehow important. So my personal specialty is actually understanding how different types of predictions might differ in the brain. And one of these differences is between exactly what Susan said. So predicting what will happen next and predicting when will it happen. And so what we find, for example, is that these two different types of predictions actually hijack different types of neural mechanisms, most likely. But indeed, if you can predict when things will happen, then your predictions of contents are much more efficient. So first of all, the surprise signals will be stronger, but then they are also resolved faster. And so this is this interplay of what and when that I think is also one of the key features of music, but also other signals, just to sort of agree a bit with Micha that, for example, speech patterns also have this dual what and when feature as well.
Well, and to continue that co-evolution question, how closely linked are auditory functions with our other functions such as motor, visual, etc.?
Go.
Well, no, I think Ryszard, this is more your cup of tea, right? Or not?
So yeah, I mean, in both relationships, so between audio and movement, right? So this is super strong at the level of neural circuits. So if we even listen to very simple beats, very simple rhythms, usually our motor structures also will be active. And indeed, there's this debate to what extent actually our entrainment, if there is first of all entrainment, to what extent this entrainment is driven by motor activity. So to what extent do we kind of simulate movements to music, and then these movement simulations, even if we don't act on them, to what extent they might actually drive auditory entrainment. But this mutual interaction between auditory and motor regions, I think, is quite clear from the work so far. But then audiovisual interactions are also quite interesting. And there's a lot of evidence that, for example, they are not so symmetric. So, for example, if we have to hold some auditory information in memory, we can actually see neural activity in visual cortices that also correlate with that auditory memory. And even more strikingly, we can decode auditory information from visual brain regions. So this is much easier to observe in this direction from audio to vision than vice versa, although, of course, there are also some studies that show these mutual interactions. But yeah, these systems are very much integrated and interacting a lot.
Humans evolved to have these very, very thick bidirectional tracks that link the auditory region with the motor region. It might surprise you to learn that sound is the fastest of our 5 senses to be processed. We evolved to process audio really quickly and send a message to the motor cortex. This is for survival reasons, of course. If you're an ancient proto-human and you're out there in the wild and you hear a rustling behind you, you need to be able to get out of the way. So vision processing takes a little bit longer, but we only have that visual information coming from the front of our face, whereas sound can process information that's coming from all directions, above and below and behind us. So we've got these thick bidirectional neural tracks that link sound to our motor regions, which is why we can dance. We can synchronize what we hear with how we move. Turns out that monkeys can't dance. All the studies that have tried to get chimps to show entrainment to a beat have pretty much failed. There are a couple of chimps that can do it, but only at one tempo, and it's going to be really precise. Nearly all human beings can dance. The reason that monkeys can't perform this same feat is because they don't have those same bidirectional thick neural tracks, that loop that links audio and motor regions. Another species that does have that and can dance are members of the parrot family. It is thought that these bidirectional tracks evolved to facilitate language. Parrots are vocal learners. When we use our voice to express something, we need to be able to both hear and control our voice with our muscles to make the sound we want to make, even if that's a rhythmic sound or a non-rhythmic sound. So we've got those neural tracks and that connectivity in part because we are a vocal species.
So isn't there not, again, a bit of a cheesecake argument going on?
In what way?
Well, in that with these bidirectional big tracks that facilitate language are then exploited, hijacked, repurposed for our ability to appreciate music.
Yeah, undeniably, humans evolved to process the sound of speech. And for you audio developers, you should remember that. There is no sound in our world that is more important than the sound of speech. The shape of our pinnae, the sensitivity we have to frequencies between 1K and 5K, all of that evolved so that we can communicate with one another through speech. For most of us, that happens in the left temporal lobe above your left ear. But the counter argument is the speciality for melody and tonality, which happens for most of us in that right hemisphere. And the recent studies that show the left hemisphere in the auditory region, that's our fast processor. It has to be, because the difference between speech consonants happens really fast. Your audio processor on that left-hand side has got to be really quick. It's the right side that's the slower processor and can take its time. And the reason it takes its time is because a single pitch means absolutely nothing. A pitch only means something when it is preceded by and followed by another pitch. It's pitch relations that matter. So this guy over here takes its time. The speciality for processing linguistic information on one side and intonation, pitch changes, tonality on the other side is a strong argument of homologous evolution of these two things evolving to be ideally suited for two separate types of signals, a melodic one and an informational linguistic one.
Oh, great. Thank you. That's so much information.
Sorry.
Just a slightly different tack. How closely related are the ways that the brain model works versus machine-based neural networks, deep learning?
It's a broad question. So are you interested in the role of prediction or in neural networks in general?
Well, I mean, people who maybe don't know how the brain works or computers work might think they work the same. How true is that, yes or no?
How true is it, yes or no? Well, I think Ryszard and I have a bit of a different take on this. But personally, so I wouldn't say that the brain works like a computer, although it would work like some kind of computer. But if we zoom into looking at the particular type of computer technology, it's the generative AI that has been captivating many of us in the past years. So things like GPT, but also the image generation models and self-supervised learning techniques, how we can make neural networks recognize images. What is kind of interesting is that what we find is that the signals that are most efficient at training these neural networks, how to make sense of language, how to make sense of images, how to make sense of music even, that's a particular type of predictive self-supervised learning. And you can predict multiple things, right? So if you think of images, you could predict pixels. If you think of language, you can predict letters or syllables or words. And what is very striking is that the very same teaching signals or prediction objectives that work best to train AI models, like predicting the next word or predicting images at a high level of abstraction, are also the best predictors of brain activity. So we see if we quantify the predictability of a stimulus, or we quantify the predictability of a word in a text, and we compare that to humans listening to that text, we see that the very same quantity we measure and we use to train on neural networks is the quantity that predicts brain activity the best. So that may indicate, at least to me, that indicates that the human brain is learning and constantly trying to make sense and update its models, using a very similar predictive learning operation and a very similar predictive learning objective, and actually predicting algorithmically something very similar as is now making neural networks and AI very successful. So there's a deep similarity there, despite all the differences that also exist.
Yeah, some of the differences are more actually pragmatic than about the construction of the network itself. So, for example, one big difference is that typically artificial neural networks are trained separately from then sort of deploying them for different tasks. So this training stage is quite long, and then once you've trained a model, you kind of start using it, and the brain has it all mixed up. So basically, you at the same time learn and predict and get surprised and try to minimize it. So this is all one coherent set of operations that happens all the time. And of course, there are some ways of making these artificial neural networks a bit more brain-like, or even perhaps a bit more like groups of humans. So one influential idea a few years ago was the generative adversarial network idea. So basically pitching two artificial neural networks against each other, and so trying for one to outcompete the other. And by doing so, each model would learn the structure of sort of the environment, but also try to be better than the other model. And that was actually a very helpful trick. But also now what is sort of at the forefront is to make these artificial neural network even more like what we think the brain does in the process of prediction. So there's this startup in the UK where actually some of the key figures in the neuroscience and the theoretical neuroscience of prediction are also scientific advisors there. And so one of the main differences with traditional neural networks is that these neural networks are embodied in basically either artificial robots or in real robots, like in drones. So they have this active component as well. So it's not just sitting and sort of being bombarded by information and making bad guesses, but at the same time interacting with the environment. And so by having these interactions, the training might be actually much faster, and then it can also transfer to different contexts much easier.
Oh, thanks.
Right.
So to move on to the idea of learning, Susan, in your book, this is what it sounds like. You discussed realism versus abstraction and the types of visual images that people prefer when they listen to music. And given that colors and textures conjure up associations, maybe as a music interface designer, I'd want that data on the music genres that my customers were using my tools to sculpt. Is this a future science fiction possibility, or is this something we could be in reach of?
Yeah, you and I talked about that when we met at the AES convention in New York in October. I don't make products, but I know that every time I go to buy so much as a granola bar, they ask me to sign up for a rewards program. Everybody wants your email now, so I would assume that if you design audio equipment, you've got email information on who purchases that plug-in or that gear. So I would assume you just write to them and ask them, can you tell us what you're using this for? What genre of music? We're collecting some data. Would you be so kind as to tell us what style of music you work in primarily? The reason we talked about that had to do with the fact that all listening brains have preferences as to the style of music that is most rewarding to them, just as we have our preferences for movies and books and visual painting and things like that. Some music listeners like their music to be abstract, meaning they like their music made with computer-generated instrumentation. I'm old school. I like my music played on real physical acoustical instruments. The reason for this distinction appears to be the type of visualizations you enjoy having when you listen to your music. Do you like a realistic sort of imaginary scene to unfold in your mind, or something that involves abstract shapes and colors, or maybe outer space or things like that, or zombies or dragons or spaceships or whatever you like to visualize when you daydream? Anyway, if audio designers are aware of the style of music in which their customers are working, they might be able to optimize visually those interfaces such that it helps promote a consistent and coherent imaginary experience.
Thanks. Micha, Ryszard, do you have any comments on that?
I'm not sure if I do, to be honest. I'm not, I don't work on app development. But I mean, as I mentioned before, so this audio-visual interaction is super important, and especially sort of the auditory to visual. So the role of visual imagery in processing music is definitely something that we can also see as a basic phenomenon in processing any sound. So that would make a lot of sense that, you have to have some kind of a coherence between the two. Yeah.
You guys know about the studies that took place maybe 15, 20 years ago? I'm thinking of one in particular that showed trains, and these trains were colored different colors. There was a blue one, a red one, green, white, gray. And there was a sound of the train moving from left to right, let's say. And participants were asked to rank order how fast these trains were going. And there was actually no difference in the sound, but people rank ordered them according to color. It was statistically significant that the red train seemed to be going the fastest. I think it was the green train was going the slowest. And there was no difference at all. In the early days of the iPod, they presented, this is so bad and so good. Good science, bad for music lovers. They presented identical playlists on iPods that were different colors and asked people to rate the music in these playlists. The black iPod, the white iPod for females, the pink iPod was considered great music. The brown iPod, not good at all. The exact same music was rated as being worse when it was delivered through a brown iPod. And the conversation, Rebekah, that we had to do with whether or not the visual design of your plugins and tools is affecting your perception of the sound. I think we can tentatively say, yes, it definitely is. And so that's why it would be important to understand what genre people are working in so that the style of music is consistent with the tools you're using and they feel compatible.
You should have told me about the
Okay.
study before, then I wouldn't have wear a brown sweater today.
I think it only works for music. I don't think it works.
Okay, well, I'm in a musical conference, but
I just have one last question before I'm going to open up for questions. And why do we seek out sad music when we are sad?
Yeah, so I think this is kind of a similar idea of why we might want to listen to very sort of loud music when we're angry. Or there's actually also work on people watching horror movies that there is some evidence that actually people with high anxiety traits like horror movies because it's like a safe environment in which you can re-experience these emotions. This is usually the key motivation for listening to sad music when you're sad. You re-experience the emotions, but in a safe environment, in a well-explained environment, so you can kind of reduce your uncertainty about your own body sensations. You can kind of be more connected to your own feelings in that way through an external stimulus. So it's this, sort of like a simulation almost that you can, again, re-experience something, but at the same time, you know that it will resolve in a particular manner, just like a horror movie really ends on a familiar note.
Wouldn't you say there's a type of pain relief with sad music when you're sad?
It can be, but there's a small minority of people who actually become sad when they listen to sad music, and so they avoid it. But the vast majority of us like it. One of the more recent studies I read suggested that what we like about it is simply the feeling of having feelings, being reminded that we are human and that we can change our emotions. There goes my voice, that we can change our emotions and that we can feel something deeply. And as you said, Ryszard, in a safe environment. The philosopher Ian Cross said, it's having someone walk with us to the edge of the cliff, look over the cliff, and then walk back with us back to that safe spot, that sadness ends, it resolves after 3 or 4 minutes, and that we like that feeling.
until you press repeat. I must say, I was personally always kind of fascinated by this phenomenon, and I thought there was something deeply masochistic in me, that every time I was very sad, I had my playlists on Spotify I would resort to immediately. And then I became familiar with this concept of walking to the cliff, as Susan puts it, or having a toy model in a way, if you want to be a bit more technical about it, a safe environment, a sort of simulation of your emotion. And then recently when I had a sad incident in my life and I went to those playlists again, that gave me a sense of comfort, actually. I wasn't being masochistic with myself, but I was training, as it were.
You as a neuroscientist, Micha, do you think why?
Well, I'm completely compelled by this explanation, and I didn't come up with it myself, but I was just trying to say that it was also personally comforting and soothing for me to know why, at least to have this story for why I was doing what I was doing.
I guess so, meaning like what's happening in the brain on your neural level when you feel comfortable.
Yeah, and that there's maybe a method to the madness.
It was thought some years ago, David Huron proposed that maybe the reason we like sad music is for the same reason that we like roller coasters. We like the feeling of imminent danger while knowing that we're totally safe on this roller coaster. And he said maybe we like the feeling of being reminded of sadness and also being reminded simultaneously that we're safe, we're okay. And that feeling of being moved makes us feel human, and it can unlock a pathway to the release of some emotions, or at least some emotional growth. You know, sometimes your emotion isn't quite ready to come out, but you can at least open that door, peek inside, in a safe way and then shut the door again. You don't have to fling it open and walk through it necessarily.
Thanks. So a deep well, I'm sure, of things to learn here. Has anyone got any questions? Yes.
Oh yeah, fantastic panel, by the way. Hello. Yeah, so I, at the risk of repeating a conversation that maybe Rebekah's had already, I'm really interested in the idea of latency. I'm a musician, a drummer mainly, but I play other instruments. So I've noticed there's a wide range of permissible amounts of latency depending on what sort of musical activity you're engaging in. I wonder if any of you could speak to that and maybe explain, why there's such a wide range there.
Well, I've already said a lot in the last session about this. I will also be curious what other people have to say.
I know of one incredible paper that came out, I think in 2020, this was mind-blowing, that looked at the ideal synchronization point between visual stimuli and the audio. And this was from a video game designer who helped fund this research. Anyway, they were interested in, do we like perfect synchrony? It turns out that we don't. And this was on the order of microseconds, but internally in our nervous system, we each have our own internal method for linking what we see with what we hear. There are multiple nuclei in the brain that compare visual input with audio input. And we've already developed a system that says, this works for me. These are as in sync as I like these two things to be. When video game manufacturers made the audio and the video in perfect sync, people didn't perform as well in this task as when it was microseconds now, slightly off, but in such a way that it matched or complemented the viewer's own internal synchronization. So that's a really interesting thing. And we mustn't assume that perfect synchronization is perfect. It would behoove us to experiment with it and see, if task performance or whatever goes up, and if we're so slightly microseconds again out of sync.
So, Mike, maybe also had something to add?
Yeah, well, maybe just a small anecdote from sort of the neuroscience, the history of neuroscience. So maybe as engineers, we'll probably have a sort of competition towards who can reduce latency the most. And in neuroscience, people have also been on a race to sort of understand the latency of the brain, sort of the speed of thought or the speed of information transfer in the brain. And after some time, sort of this question sort of dissolved because it's not so well defined, just like what you said, that latency, different types of latency are permissible in different contexts. The speed of information transfer also depends on the context. And what the nervous system actually does is, because it's predicting all the time, when events are predictable, latencies become shorter. And it's been demonstrated in great detail, for instance, in the nervous system of a cat, that when auditory and also visual stimuli are highly predictable, but then omitted, you can actually see or they're delayed or they're omitted. You can see the response to the omitted stimulus, even though the stimulus is not yet there, or even though it's not there at all. So the brain is actively canceling latency and creating anti-latency. And that's also because the brain is itself a hierarchical system. So that's quite different from when you have, let's say, two instruments and one computer, and you have one latency from the guitar to the computer, for instance. You have one latency from one neuron to the next, and the brain operates in time. So there's not one latency for the brain. There are various latencies at the same time, and it depends on the predictability and therefore on the context. So what is much more killing to the brain is jitter. And latency, you can get away with a lot of latency. And the amount you can get away with depends on the predictability and the familiarity of the context and how much people are in tune with each other.
I think everyone here would agree it's the jitter, not the latency.
Hello. Oh, it's very bright back there, so I'm going to go this way again. So the first thing is there is actually a study that statistically very much showed that food tastes worse on blue plates. So I think this goes in with the color of the iPads. But my question was, as a prediction engine and predicting music, I think that's part of why pop music is very predictable with chord changes that repeat. So does our love of surprising things, like an unexpected chord change or the loud guitars and creep, does that go into the same category as being scared in a safe place, or is that something else?
Yeah, I think that's exactly the idea. So actually, of course, pop music is relatively predictable, but you still have a lot of syncopation quite often, right? You have a lot of these kinds of micro surprises in even very regular music, and most of us don't like to listen to just metronomes, right? Like this is an example of a stimulus that is just too boring for most of us, and so it's quite easy to come up with a pretty formal model, but actually that works, and that it describes the sweet spot for how much surprise do we like in music. And so basically you can think of, if something is very regular, it's completely not surprising. And if something is very random, it will be very surprising. But at the same time, if something is very regular, you will have a very high precision, or you will be very certain of it. And then if it's very random, you will be very uncertain. And if you multiply these two things by each other, you get this kind of an inverted U-shape function. And so this very broadly explains why we like some degree of surprise, but not too much. But of course, every person will have this sweet spot somewhere else. So there's also a lot of work on how even different brain structures might predict your individual tolerance for surprise or for unpredictability in music.
Was there like many like sort of studies on like the relationship your brain would have to music, like pre like the streaming era, like when, I don't know, one would just like listen to like the music they'd like buy on a CD, rather than nowadays where like there's like an overwhelming amount of music that usually comes with stuff like decision fatigue.
I'm not sure I understand the essence of the question. Is there a difference between consuming music on a CD versus having the unlimited choice of a streaming service? Is that the question?
I was more like seeing whether like, I guess it's a bit of a weird wording one. Come back to me.
Maybe the question was, does this do anything to the brain, right? Is there an effect on the brain of having this unlimited sea of suggestions from Spotify versus going deep into one album?
Yeah.
I have no idea, but I'm looking to see.
I don't know that streaming's been around long enough for us to have a corpus of data on what it's doing to our brain. Remember, there's something called evolutionary lag, which talk about lag. It's in order for our brains to change, it's gonna take an awful long time for our brains to, as a species, fundamentally change. So I don't know that we can say that there's that much of a difference. I think if you asked an expert on decision making, they might tell you like, having so much choice in our world today might be anxiety provoking, but I don't know. I'm just supposing there.
Yeah. I think what I was like,
sorry. Oh, sorry.
I think like what I was like maybe trying to get at, I guess it's like purely anecdotal, but I found that like pre like the streaming era, like I would have like maybe a more profound like sort of like relationship to music because like of the limited amount of choice. And like now that it has, I feel like I don't give stuff the same amount of time, and I don't know whether that relates to any sort of, I don't know, like brain studies that you guys can do. If it's a no, like no worries.
It's a tough question. Because I think it was Yuval Harari in his book *Sapiens*. He said, "We invent technology and then it changes us." So the technology changes much more rapidly than the brain does. So the poor brain is just doing the best it can with what it's got out there. And it will change us as individuals, but how it changes us as a species, the question there involves how do the brains of future generations reflect optimization for streaming music versus just listening to an album. It's going to take some time before we know the answer to that. We do know it on an individual level, however. We know what we like and what we're used to.
My question is a bit related to the question of Andrew a while ago. There have been some studies that say that pop music in Western societies are getting simpler and simpler in terms of rhythmic patterns and melodies and stuff like that. So it would suggest, like, as a society, we want more predictability over more surprise. Do you agree with that? And how would you interpret that?
Well, I would interpret it maybe as an interface between how we listen to music, so just to link to the previous question. When people are listening to streaming platforms more and more, maybe music is adapting itself to the recommendation algorithms, which are sort of hacking our sort of inherent reward systems. And maybe music will, just like television for babies is becoming more sort of attention grabbing and almost sort of formulaic in that sense. Maybe pop music is also becoming more and more generic and systematic, sort of hijacking this sort of biological inherent things we find pleasurable. But maybe that's a very mundane explanation. I see Susan looking pensive.
No, I'm thinking about Charles Darwin. I always go back to him when I don't know the answer to a biological question. But we know that popular music strikes, for the time, the ideal balance between novelty and familiarity, as Ryszard was saying earlier with the inverted U of stimulus complexity. We don't like our music to be too unpredictable. Not a lot of people listen to free-form jazz. And not a lot of adults listen to children's music either, because that's too predictable. We like our popular music to be enough innovation and enough familiarity. We like a certain tempo range, right around 100 to 120 beats per minute. That aligns well with our bodies and how we like to move. We like a nice blend of consonant and dissonant musical intervals, mostly tipping toward consonant with a little bit of dissonance thrown in for flavor. We like love songs. And essentially, as Charles Darwin said, we need music to help us find a mate. And so our popular music constantly changes to keep up with new trends in fashion and how we flirt and how we dance, how we, what our courtship rituals are in the moment. Our popular music evolves to serve that while hewing to something that's familiar enough that we get it. 4/4 time signature, that certain sweet spot for tempo, the certain melodic range that humans have always preferred. We hang in there, and then we just do the same thing, but with new instruments and sometimes some new rhythms.
Thank you. I'm so sad I could listen for hours more on these topics. There's many, many more. Please thank you, these incredible people who've come to give us information.